So what is virtual presence and how can you maximize and elevate yours? Well, your virtual presence is how you engage, collaborate, lead, inspire others, motivate others in your virtual world. And there are a couple of things that each and every one of us can be doing as our virtual worlds and our hybrid worlds continue to expand. So if we're looking at being on camera, please remember that you want the camera of your computer screen to be eye level with you. So while now I'm looking into the video camera, if I'm on a Zoom call or a WebEx call or a Microsoft Teams call or whatever platform you use, I want to be looking into my computer camera. That's synonymous with looking at you. You want as much light in front of you as possible because we want to see you. We don't want you to look like a cardboard cutout or like you're in the witness protection program. And then think about your background. Now I have a unique background today because I'm actually in Johannesburg, South Africa, visiting my mother. And so I've chosen this beautiful garden background, but if you use a virtual background, make sure it's not too distracting. And then be intentional about really connecting with people virtually. So for my seminars, workshops, keynotes on how to elevate your virtual presence, please go onto my website, nadiaspeaks.com. So I am so delighted today to not only be talking about virtual presence, Zanele, but actually putting it into practice. So I have the absolute pleasure of having somebody who is self-described as the unlearning lady, Zanele Njapha. And Zanele comes to us all the way from Johannesburg, South Africa. And Zanele, everybody talks about learning and you talk about unlearning. So tell us how you got to be the unlearning lady.
Thank you so much for having me, Nadia. It's such an honor to be here on the platform with you and be speaking to you today. So really to give a little bit of a background as to the unlearning concept, my past life, as I like to call it, was as a primary school teacher. So I did a lot of work in the primary school classroom, really understanding how people learn, the development of children in that space, more especially in education. And then what I started to realize, especially going into some corporates and helping them to understand the future of work, was that somewhere in between when we're children and when we are in our corporate environments, we were looking to build future skills. But every single day as a primary school teacher, I was noticing that children were playful, they were inquisitive, they were frank. They exhibited so many of what we were calling future skills already as children. But then somewhere down the line, we get into our work environments and we say we want to learn future skills. So somewhere in between, something was going wrong. We were putting all of these different layers on ourselves that needed us to peel them off in order to come back to a space where we were agile, flexible, adaptable, and all of these other future skills. And that's when this concept of the unlearning lady was born. And my clients started calling me that as soon as I did some facilitation and work in the corporate space that I do now. This word was born, unlearning, helping individuals and organizations to peel back these layers, almost empty the cup and start to think about how do we move forward by peeling these layers.
Then, of course, you had been doing this work for a long time, and then 2020 happens, and suddenly we are catapulted into both having to learn and unlearn. How did 2020 impact your life and career? And then what advice and guidance do you have as we grapple once again with having to both learn and unlearn?
Sure, that is such a fantastic question, hey Nadia. And I think 2020 will always be such a watershed year where so many of us go. The way that we perceive life, ourselves, each other has completely changed. And that for me is where the biggest unlearning conversation or biggest lesson comes in, especially for me, when 2020 was such a big year for me, but also for so many of us. And the biggest lesson we can take out of it as it pertains to unlearning is always extending the grace to ourselves to show up differently. Because here's what usually happens, Nadia. You and I always expect ourselves to show up as the exact same person to a situation. So much so that when someone asks us, hey, how would you react to someone doing 1, 2, and 3 to you? Instantly, you will respond with a certain response. But you don't know 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line, if you will respond in the exact same way. And we shouldn't expect that from ourselves. And so 2020, I think, was such a great year in the sense only that it helped us to really understand that change is something we need to embrace, but with a nice big pinch, if we can call it that, of empathy and that grace for ourselves to say, I allow myself to change, because often we need permission to do it because we feel like we always have to show up the same. So that for me was the biggest lesson in my own career, but now also something I speak to so many organizations about. Allow the systems and the space and the procedures for us to show up differently, for people to be okay with not being the same team, the same leader, the same employee that they were yesterday.
So, Zanele, doesn't that come down to the fact that change in and of itself is so frightening? You know, on a primitive level, we fear change because we want to survive, and change is synonymous with danger in our minds. How do you work with individuals and organizations to help them understand that change doesn't necessarily mean a threat?
That's a very good question. Two things. So I recently wrote an article about this, especially for leaders. And I feel like all of us are self-leading as well, constantly. So two main things, I think, Nadia, that come to mind with regards to that question. The very first one is you want to create an environment for yourself, but also if you're leading others, for those others to grieve what they used to have. And this is often where we make the big mistake, is we often don't acknowledge that people have had to let go of something. And that's a big deal. When you and I change in any given situation, we transition, we unlearn, to use that word, we're letting go of something that's become so dear to us, that's, and to use a word that you use, has been safe to us. It's got a sense of safety for us. So that first part, first of the two, is allow yourself and those you work with to grieve the way that things used to be. Whether that means we sit around the table and have coffee and just talk about how great things were, and just how amazing that leader was and the impact that they had, how great the system or the procedure that we've now had to let go of actually was to us. So that's the first part. And then the second part that I think is quite important and goes hand in hand with that, and also speaks to the grabbing hold. So there's the letting go and the grabbing hold, and you want to speak to both of those. So with regards to the grabbing hold, one thing you do want to do is you want to tell people why. You really want to make sure that it's not just about, hey, our company is changing and here's why it's good for the organization. Here's why it's good for our numbers. Here's why it's good for the global team. But you really want to make sure that you're giving people that connection, so that they've made a connection between the future of the organization and their own personal futures, where they see themselves going. And I think when we apply that to ourselves as individuals, you want to make it mean something. Because if where you want to be or where the world is moving into in 2020 doesn't mean something for you, you're going to have a really hard time getting up in the morning and waking yourself up and saying, I want to show up as my best self. So those are the really big things for me, especially when it comes to just dealing with the trauma of change that's constant, and with change fatigue being something that's also quite real. It's important for us to acknowledge. It's always great to just start off by grieving. Give yourself an opportunity to just look back and say, oh my goodness, yes, it was quite great, and validate those emotions. I think that's very important.
So
Then the
putting
second
that in
part.
oh, yes. Carry on,
Yeah.
please.
So that just
This is gold.
just to the second part was just telling yourself why, making sure that that why is super clear. Yeah, go ahead, Nadia.
Oh, no, I was going to say it's so wonderful interviewing you, because I've had the pleasure of Zanele interviewing me. So you are skilled at both, Zanele. Anyway, what I wanted to say in the context of what we're dealing with now. So we're 2022 and people thought they might be going back to work. And in fact, some are going back to the office. So for some people, they're grieving the flexibility of working from home. And for others, they had hoped to return to normal and they're not. So let's just think about right now, if you're joining Zanele Njapha and I. Zanele is an expert in the area of transitions and change. She's known as the unlearning lady because she says unlearning is important as learning. And Zanele, right now, so you're joining Zanele and I, and you want to stay working from home, but in fact, your organization has said, no, you need to go in. So that flexibility is gone. That's the scenario for some of my clients in LA. Then the other is those people who had hoped that life would return to normal, but it hasn't.
Yeah,
So
I
what do
think
we say
that's
to them?
sure, sure. So that's quite a real scenario, and one that I've been hearing a lot of my clients speaking about as well is how do we respond to that? And that really brings in this area of rethinking our careers, Nadia, because the Great Resignation has seen millions of women, more especially women, because this is the space that I love to sort of dabble in as well. Women, more women than ever before in history, leaving the workforce.
Yes.
Because what we've realized, and this is the key thing, if you're watching this and you're starting to rethink your career, the key thing is that we have realized that careers no longer need to be what they used to be, and that we now almost have an opportunity to mold our careers into what we want. And what does that really mean?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's exciting, isn't it? It's really
Yes.
exciting.
And it's both exciting, but also for some people who are used to being prescribed to, it can be daunting.
Yes, it can. So maybe let's talk a little bit then about what that looks like. What does it look like to start to take charge of your career and almost unlearn? And this is where the unlearning comes so beautifully into thinking about careers. Because some of the, and I've got something coming up quite soon, and at the end of January masterclass, we're talking about unlearning some of the key
Please,
things in our
please.
careers. It's just really three key mindsets, and I'll maybe just speak to one of them. Is this idea that your job is set in your role. So most of us, I love to give the example, Nadia, and you let me know if you've noticed this as well. When we go to these networking events and someone says, hey, Nadia, introduce yourself. Maybe, knock on wood, I mean, so many people know you where I'm from, but maybe people don't know you. What most of us instantly will do is that we'll go, hi, I'm Zanele, and I'm a transitions facilitator at Tomorrow Today Global. Instantly, we slap that label of our jobs onto who we are. Have you noticed something like that?
Absolutely. And
Mm-hmm.
people come up with this elevator pitch and this sound bite about themselves, and you feel bad if you haven't perfected yours to two snappy sentences. Yes.
Yes, absolutely. And the point of that is you and I have gotten into this societal norm where we reduce ourselves to our careers. And I love to invite people to almost come out of that, come out of your role, as in what you do, but then also come out of your title. Because what trends around the future of work are showing us is that the people who restrict themselves into their titles have a harder opportunity with transitioning into whatever their role is going to look like in the coming 10, 20, 30 years. So, what you want to unlearn here is really this idea that you're a marketeer, that you're a software engineer. You almost want to look at what's behind that. And what's behind that is the value that you give to the
Mm.
marketplace. Who do you serve? How do their lives become better? And when you stick with that theme, it means that in 20 years' time, Nadia, when I'm no longer looking for a software engineer, you can still fill that gap by understanding the value that you give. So I think that for me has been so important because we come into our roles and into our workplaces with these ideas of what a job is, what an income is, what a workplace is. And we find that those end up hindering our progression and how well we work with others in the process as well.
You've described that so well. So just to recap, what you're saying is, I do a lot of programs around the concept of personal branding. And I say, Jeff Bezos said it so well, that a brand for a company or a product is like a reputation for a person. And part of being able to brand yourself is your ability to communicate your strengths. But you're saying communicate your strengths not in terms of a job title, but what value you bring. So if you aren't at work that day, what do people miss about you? What about you as a team player or as a collaborator? What are the values that you project and contribute to your team? I think that's so powerful. Now, Zanele, how do you help an organization understand this and share this with their employees? Because the book I'm writing at the moment with David Asano is called Ramplify, and it's how do you ramp up your existing business and amplify your reach? And one of the chapters is around learning. How do we help individuals in our organization develop the kind of mindset that you are recommending?
Okay, cool. Great question. So I think the first part, so it's really a three-step sort of system that I use around this work. And the very first part is awareness. So understanding at any given time that we're making assumptions about everything. I often ask my clients to just name some of the assumptions they made about me when I came onto screen. People will look at your hair, they'll look at your background, they'll look at all sorts of things, and without even knowing it, and it's natural. Our brain makes assumptions to fill in gaps. Now, that's okay. But the second layer of awareness is realizing that you have an opportunity to assume again. And I love what Adam Grant says in his book, Think Again. That for me is the first part of unlearning. Let's create an opportunity in organizations where people are aware of the assumptions they made first, and don't be ashamed of what you assumed about someone, about a workplace, about a system, about the culture of the organization. Face that assumption and then give yourself an opportunity to assume again with new information, with new stimuli, with new conversations with people. So always be open to making new assumptions all the time, with the understanding that you will always be making them. At least be more informed, right? So I think that makes a bit more sense for me. Open yourself up to making new assumptions every time. So that's the first part, is the awareness. And then second to that is strategizing or planning. Now that we've got that awareness, let's put together a plan, not necessarily set in stone, but one that's constantly moving and agile, but helps us to direct our actions. And I often like to say, especially when we have the learning and unlearning conversation, you want to break your plan up so that you can build momentum and track. And this is the really important part. When you're unlearning anything, it needs that empathy of tracking what's working and then going back and saying, guess what? It didn't work as well as we thought. Let's recalibrate. And that's why it's important to have a plan, because it does help us to redirect. And that's the second way that I help organizations, is facilitating those conversations around plans to build a culture of learning and unlearning and relearning. And then the last part, which is possibly my favorite, and I think you touched on this a little bit earlier, Nadia, is accountability. Having individuals, but also having systems around us as a team where we can change together. Some very interesting piece of research says that the number one variable that will determine the success of change in an organization is if we change together. Gone are the days of leaders saying, hey, just everybody just run. But if we feel like we're all on the journey together, magic happens. And that's why that final part is so key. So you want to build that awareness, and then
I'm going to write this in the chat.
Yes, it's juicy, isn't it? And you want to build that awareness around it, then you strategize, and then you end off with going, okay, how do we build a system that people can constantly fall back on and not feel like they are pressured, but feel like they can constantly be learning and discovery? It's this theme of curiosity and discovery for me that's really exciting around unlearning, feeling like there's always something new to discover, something new to learn, and we're not beholden to who we were yesterday, because we have the opportunity to choose.
And you said something so powerful, which is creating an environment where people are changing together. So off the top of your head, when you think about organizations that are agile, that do implement this, and I don't know if you can be specific, or we can talk about case studies of, famously, we know that Blockbuster did not change rapidly enough and didn't anticipate change. And obviously, there might have been employees within Blockbuster who were waving that flag and saying, let's change, but nobody listened. So how do we create companies? And then I'm just curious, and it doesn't have to be now, we can have this in our next conversation, but what organizations are doing this well? And I'm also curious if people feel that they are working for an organization that is either dictated to or they feel part of. Yes. So it's an interesting thing to look at.
It is. It always is. And for me, when I look at these case studies, I often like to look more at the themes that come through, because sometimes we hear about the same organizations, right? And the one I'm going to name is probably going to have a lot of people eye rolling. But what I want you to do is look at the themes that come through. And that's why I just love looking at this organization and how they continuously exhibit some of these really great unlearning principles. So the organization that I'm referring to is IBM. And the reason why
Okay.
I really love using IBM as an example, and a few others, but this one really does stand out in our current conversation, is because even though, I mean, there are generations and generations IBM has been around, but we've seen so many key, almost watershed moments in the life of that organization. Yes, they're quite large. Yes, they don't necessarily compare to others that are more on a startup scale or anything else. But there have been moments within the history of the organization where they've just had an opportunity to relearn who they once were. I mean, we look at right in the beginning when IBM was more hardware associated, and how they were in an opportunity where they just look at the amount of debt they were in and just how much financial trouble they were in. They had to make a call whether or not to switch over into a more software associated organization. And that jump really helped them. Another big jump was around the early 2000s when Lou Gerstner was involved in the organization, when they had to think about how do we become more agile, because we noticed that if we don't, we could become obsolete. And this is when they brought in what I love this, the EBOs, the emerging business opportunities in the company. And this is when they had little business units where people can innovate and come up with creative ideas and blow things up on a smaller scale so that they could bring them into the larger organization. And this, for me, is where we see those principles coming through. Take away that it's a big organization that's got a lot of manpower, a lot of woman power behind it, but look at the principle of creating a little system within your organization when you understand what the current context needs from you. And if the current context, like with the example from IBM, needs for you to be innovative, you ask yourself, what does innovation need from us now? How do we create a system or an opportunity for us to become innovative? You look at exactly that and you say, okay, because we're a bit big right now, what we might need is to break things down. How do we make sure that we're thinking of new ideas? We're testing these new ideas in record time so that we can start to implement. And sometimes that means culling some of the projects that you had and going back. And there are a bunch of different opportunities. Now, the most recent one is how IBM has almost done this whole split into two different companies where they've risked what we've always known them to be, but for the sake of this constant innovation and revamping ourselves, and not saying, hey, this is the IBM we started off as, but going, what do our clients need from us now? And how do we show up in the best way possible? Even if that means unlearning who you once were.
You've put that so well, because what I'm hearing is it's on a micro level, on a deeply personal level. Each one of us has to decide what serves us, what no longer serves us, and are we holding on to what Albert Ellis, the famous psychologist, called an irrational belief. An irrational belief is things had to be the way they were, right? So there's that. So on a personal level, are you, who are joining Zanele and I today, are you holding on to things that no longer serve you? And Zanele says maybe you have to look at them and unlearn. But on a macro level, are organizations saying what no longer serves us and what do we have to do differently? And I think that's the power of what you're doing. Is it starts on an individual basis, but often organizations and individuals aren't even aware of the obstacle of what is holding them back. So it's an interesting time to be discussing this at the start of a new year, right?
It is. Yes, because everyone is going, okay, what now? What do I need to let go of? How do I need to respond to this year in order to make that big leap and not find myself coming back to where I once was, right? Because that's the other concern that a lot of people will have. So unlearning is always a conversation, but right in the beginning, like you say, Nadia, of the year, of a new quarter, of the new half, is when we really ask ourselves, okay, if I'm going to move on, what do I need to let go of that's not going to serve me going forward? And that's the big question around unlearning, is what is it that I need to let go of and grab a hold of on the other side in order for me to progress? And it's not as easy as it sounds. And I often give people that just write out. It's not going to be easy. It's going to need a lot of momentum, but also intentionality at the beginning. And you want to set up systems around yourself that will support you when you need them.
And that's what you help people do. Zanele, it's interesting. I had a wonderful conversation with Jeff Newman from Porsche. And by the way, I know in South Africa, we talk about Porsches as Porsche, but actually Ferdinand Portia. That was his name, Portia. I always have to tell South Africans, right? His name was Ferry Portia. But anyway, Jeff Newman always says, think about this. And it's an interesting thing to think about is, what behavior did you change in the last year, right? What changed? What did you do differently? It's a good question to ask yourself. And then he goes, maybe one thing, if that, right? And then in an organization, we're asking you to change multiple things. Yeah. How hard is that? But to your point, you're saying, Zanele, first look at what you almost have to reprogram is another way of looking at it.
Yeah. Yes. And something that might make it easier, Nadia, is asking yourself rather, what do you need to grab hold of instead of what you need to let go of? I love it when Les Brown says the pull of the future is stronger than the push of the past.
Yes.
So rather than focusing on what you're resisting, maybe ask yourself, what's on the other side of the behavior? What's on the other side of the mindset? What do I want to grab hold of? And then by virtue of that grabbing hold, that learning that new habit, the other one does get pruned away the more that you build that other one. Not completely gone, because that's not how habits work. But over time, as you start to hold on to this new behavior, new way of thinking, new mindset, you do find that you move yourself forward even quicker than if you were running from something you want to unlearn.
Excellently. So you're saying it's easier to give yourself to-dos than to-don'ts. So yes. It's because as the new year starts, everyone has all these resolutions, or I like to say, revolutions. What right now, and it's interesting because, you have the famous conversation at the beginning of a new year, I'm not going to drink so much. I'm not going to eat so much. What about, I am going to do a little more cardio. I am going to drink more water. So what am I going to do versus what am I not going to do? And you say that facilitates the unlearning. So as we wrap up this fantastic conversation, and Zanele, I always say a consultation with you would be very expensive. So the fact that we get a master class, or a master class, as we say, is so helpful and wonderful that we do it on this platform. So I will make sure that people know about your event, because in your event, you're going to be helping people go through the process of unlearning. So I'll type that into the chat. And just final thoughts, if people are watching with various, or listening to us, depending on what platform they're on, with various mindsets. Some people are going, I'm excited about the new year. Some people are daunted. Some people are going, I don't know where to start. So just advice and guidance. And while I do that, won't you let me just type in when your event is and how people can reach you?
Sure. It's on the 28th. So something that we can do.
Is it on Jan 28th?
Yes, okay. 28th of January.
And where is Zanele's event, and where would they sign up for it?
It's online. So the best way for them to stay connected with me, as I sort of just release some details on it, is connecting with me via LinkedIn, going over to my website, or even following me on Instagram.
What is your website? Is
Zanele.com, ZaneleNjapha.com. So name, surname.com.
And Njapha.com. Wonderful. Fantastic. So carry on. Give us, yes, please.
Sure. Okay, so as we start to think about unlearning right in the beginning of the year, there's going to be lots and lots of different emotions that we are feeling at this time. So the most important thing for us to do is that first part that I mentioned. You want to ask yourself, what do I want to learn rather than what I want to unlearn? And I love the example you gave, Nadia. Instead of saying, I want to stop not drinking enough water, make it super specific. I want to drink 1 glass of water right in the beginning of my day. Break it up into exactly what you want to do. And then you want to set up those systems that will support you. So just to go a little bit back and maybe 2 seconds to speak about those systems, is you almost want, and I love when I heard this the first time, you want to almost set up your environment so that it gives you no choice but to unlearn or but to relearn. It's almost like rigging your environment so that it's, you have no choice. It almost just sets you up.
How does that work practically? Give us an example.
Sure, no problem. I'd love to. So let's say, for example, if you're like me and the water is something that you want to really focus on. So I think this was the beginning of 2020 when I was like, I need to drink more water. How do I set this up? How do I make sure I do it? So with that specificity, what I started to do was, because I use a very neat trick called bundling, or habit stacking, or habit bundling. You may have heard of it referred to as that way. Is when you take a habit that isn't well formed and you almost juxtapose it onto a habit that's already very, very well formed. And I asked myself, if I want to have a nice large glass of water in the beginning of my day every single day, what can I almost stack that on top of? What is it that I already do every single day without fail? And for me, that was taking a bath, that was taking a shower. So now what I do every single day since that time when I wanted to build that habit is I take my water bottle into the bathroom with me. As soon as I've had my shower, as soon as I've had my bath, I won't leave until I've had that glass of water. And that's how you almost make it easy for yourself. Hibbs' law says cells that fire together hardwire together. You want an environment that pushes you forward consistently. So find the hacks. Give yourself 10 minutes of your day, today, tomorrow, the day after, and just sit there and go, okay, what do I want to learn? How can I almost juxtapose those habits into what I'm already doing? You don't want to stress yourself out by creating a completely new environment, but you want to build on what you already have and just get excited about it. Treat it as a game and be playful. You'll be amazing at building new habits this year and unlearning.
I think we have to have a monthly conversation, and really that was so motivating. So cells that fire together, hardwire together. Zanele says give people in your organization and give yourself a chance to grieve the way things used to be. It was interesting. I was listening to an interview with Annabelle Linda, who is one of South Africa's icons of the theater and stage and film. And she said, the reason people are so nostalgic now is that things are so tough. But yes, give yourself a chance to grieve, right? That's fair. And then you said build awareness, then strategize, then build a system to change together. And then don't forget, January 28th is Zanele's event. Sign up, ZaneleNjapha.com. And she says, cells that fire together, hardwire together. So, Zanele, it has been such a pleasure talking to you about not only the process of change and learning, but also the things we need to do to unlearn to move forward. And just hoping that 2022 is a happy, healthy, and productive year. But you know the famous saying, you make your habits make you. And what are those habits? So final thoughts as we end our session today, and just such a pleasure having you join us.
Oh, thank you so much, Nadia. It's been such an honor to finally speak to you, especially after I interviewed you. It's just always amazing to have a conversation with you. Final sentence or final thoughts is just the idea that we really need to build those systems that support us. We can't rely completely on remembering things anymore or being there when we need it. Set your life up so that you can succeed with unlearning what you need to unlearn and showing up as the person you need to show up as.
Fantastic. And I'm going to put this interview on YouTube. I have fantastic interviews like this on YouTube. So I'm going to urge everybody to change your habit. Go onto my YouTube channel, which is Nadia Vilcek YouTube, and subscribe so you can hear other fabulous conversations like this. Zanele Njapha, thank you